Good afternoon, everyone. We are so excited to have so many of you joining us for this Partnering for Success webinar. I'm Tony Sabo, Senior Strategic Initiative Analyst here at ECS, and I'm so pleased to welcome you today. Partnering for Success is designed to provide you with opportunities to connect with peers, researchers, and innovators who are providing solutions to some of today's most pressing education policy issues. It is always our goal in these webinars to leave you with insights, inspirations, and resources that will help you more effectively address the challenges you face within your states. Today's webinar will focus on the impact and solutions for the increase in uncertified and new teachers. The Southern Regional Education Board forecasts that by 2030, as many as 16 million K-2 students in the South may be taught by an unprepared or inexperienced teacher. We are grateful today to discuss the issue and possible solutions to ensure our nation's students receive a quality education. With that, we have a dynamic lineup today that includes Daniel Chuda, Deputy Commissioner, Maine Department of Education, and Dwight Jones, former Commissioner of Education in Colorado and former Superintendent of Clark County School Districts, Las Vegas, Nevada. Additionally, our moderator today will be Klaus Van Zastro, Senior Director of Policy here at ECS. Now, before we get started, we'd like to thank our partner, Teachers of Tomorrow, who help make events like this one possible. Thank you for your continued partnership and support. Additionally, I'd like to thank the rest of our ECS partners for their support this past year. We look forward to hosting more Partnering for Success webinars with you and with state education leaders throughout this year. Now, before we jump in, I would like to take a couple of seconds to talk about some housekeeping matters. First thing, this session will be recorded and sent to all registered attendees. And secondly, we encourage you to place all of your questions that you may have in the chat for the Q&A portion of today's session, which will be held at the end of this webinar. Now, let me hand it over to Klaus Van Zastro, who will get our conversation started. Klaus, the floor is all yours.
Thanks very much, Tony. And I'm really delighted today to be able to moderate this discussion with two such distinguished guests and to talk about the challenges of uncertified and unqualified teachers. But I wanted to frame this a little bit by saying that, even before the pandemic, ECS received a lot of requests from state leaders for information on how states are addressing teacher shortages in certain disciplines and in geographies. And we've also received questions on the accompanying reliance on uncertified teachers. Now, since the pandemic, these kinds of requests have been pouring in at an even higher rate, which is really understandable. It's been in the news. We've all seen a lot about it. And so as we look at this and we feel these kinds of questions from governors, staff, from legislators, from school board leaders, from state agency leaders, from really a lot of people at the state level who are really concerned with the challenge, we're seeing states try a number of solutions. And these could range from offering scholarships and tuition relief or exploring affordable housing for teachers, reducing barriers to licensure for out-of-state teachers, returning to retired teachers, apprenticeship programs, alternative routes, all sorts of solutions that are in people's minds. But even so, it's really important to have this kind of discussion today about what states can do about the challenge. And that's why I'm so delighted to introduce the two panelists we have today who will talk about this very important topic from the perspectives of their own experiences at the state and district levels. Now, Tony's already mentioned them, but we'll be speaking today with Daniel Chuda, who was himself a teacher, who has worked in education data and has been an assistant district superintendent, all before becoming deputy commissioner in the Maine Department of Education. And we'll also be speaking with Dr. Dwight Jones, who also began his career as a classroom teacher before leading large districts and a state agency, both as former superintendent, for example, of Clark County School District in Las Vegas, and as also as a former commissioner of education in Colorado. He currently serves as president of Education Partners. So with that introduction, I'm going to start with the questions. And, I wanted to start with Maine. And so, Daniel, starting with you, and this is a broad question. And the question is, how does teacher recruitment fit into your broader vision for education in Maine?
Thank you, Klaus. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to ECS and teachers up tomorrow for having this opportunity for us to have a conversation this afternoon. It's a timely topic, and as you mentioned, it's an important one for us as educators. So as a Department of Education in Maine, we have had 6 strategic priorities for a number of years now, and very specifically, one of those strategic priorities is to develop, support, and sustain a robust educator workforce. It's important to us not only that folks are able to enter the field of education if they wish to do so, because as many of us know, it is a rewarding field, but also it's not just enough to get them into the positions, but we want to make sure that we are supporting and sustaining the work that they do in those roles. So that being one of our 6 strategic priorities for the state has really helped us focus on many different efforts that I hope we'll be able to share with you this afternoon as far as what our department is able to do to support. And most often it's in partnership with other organizations and agencies in higher education across our wonderful state to be able to make this concern that we have diminish. I don't know if we'll ever get it to go away, but certainly diminish the challenge that we have.
Thanks very much. And so with that, I'm going to turn to Dr. Jones. Dwight, in your experience, you've been a school leader, a district leader, and a state leader. How do shortages that, you're trying to address affect the school environment and the student experience?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Klaus. And first of all, just again, as Daniel shared, I'd really like to thank Teachers of Tomorrow for helping to support this conversation, which is so important to all of us across the country. And as a former commissioner in Colorado, I always depended greatly on ECS. So it's really nice to be back with ECS and to have a chance to just share a few thoughts as it relates to a very, very important topic. Thank you for the question. For me, it's certainly been a little while since I've been the commissioner of Colorado, actually probably 10 years or more. And, I still remember 10 years ago that, even though this issue is kind of front and center, the early stages of this issue, we were discussing even 10 years ago. I remember hearing and starting to plan as a state commissioner for some of the concerns related to potential teacher shortages. And at that time, people were making projections or predictions. So, early days, we certainly started working a little bit with TFA, Teachers for America. We looked at Troops to Teachers. We also started early conversations about alternative certification. So it's kind of hard to believe that 10 years ago, or even longer, we've already been thinking about this issue. For me, certainly as most recently, the interim superintendent for Denver Public Schools, and I was interim superintendent right during the heart of the pandemic. So as you can imagine, when we were dealing with the pandemic, the number of teacher absences really started to hit us front and center. And then the fact that most days when we were back in school, even though we did quite a bit online, the impact on students was immediate. Principals had to start their day with trying to just make sure there was enough coverage. Some teachers would be out because maybe they had, had COVID, or there was other variety. Or what we were struggling with is a lot of teachers also had children, and their children would be out of school. And so it really became a big issue for us. And so I think for the students, though, to answer your question, the real experience, I think, has really been almost since the pandemic because of the learning loss and the fact that now we are, not only trying to catch students up for what they lost during the pandemic, but really dealing with the teacher shortage to maybe even have the experience or the expertise to even help kids kind of get back to pre-pandemic level results. So that's really been an issue and something that I think really has had a dramatic effect on students. Then if you think about the blended and online movement that kind of started through the pandemic, and the teachers that not only are, trying to find a way to say, is it in person, is it online, and can I support both environments? I know during the pandemic, that was a real challenge for a number of our teachers here and was a big concern for parents as well. And what we're fortunate though, and why I'm optimistic, Klaus, our current commissioner, Susana Cordova, who's just recently been appointed, I worked for her as a deputy right here in Denver, and she is a classroom teacher. She's a principal. She's been a school leader. She's been working in both Denver and Dallas. And we're so fortunate to have a commissioner that is in place that actually has experienced the schoolhouse and classroom. And that kind of experience, I think, will pay great dividends for us as we look to try to help solve these problems here in Colorado and to be part of the solution to help solve these problems across the country.
Thanks very much. So the next question is going to build off what you've just sort of talked about, both of you, actually. And this is a question for both of you. And it has to do with data. So, for example, Daniel, you mentioned this is a strategic priority. And of course, when you have a strategic priority, you want to be strategic, right? And, Dwight, you mentioned that already 10 years ago, there were projections and you had a lot of news stories about this. So the question about data, which is always near and dear to my heart, is around the fact that teacher workforce data can often be limited and incomplete, as I'm sure you well know, depending on state and local capacity. And so the real question is how you've used data to get a better understanding of teacher shortages in your own context, especially when we've got these blanket statements about teacher shortages that are often not as helpful as they could be if they were more targeted to the actual challenges. And so I invite either of you to jump in on this one.
Sure. So it is a bit of it's a bit of an amoeba to try to encapsulate. Maybe that's just my former science teacher self coming out that like to talk about amoebas, but it's been tricky for sure. And so last year, as a state, we launched what's referred to as the Teach Maine framework that was developed with a number of different stakeholders from across our state in many different roles to help us identify not only challenges, big and small, that we were facing as a state, but also try to come up with ideas for strategies that would help us move forward in the work that we were trying to do with educator workforce. One of the pieces that came out of that was a reinforced concern and interest in our vacancy data. Currently, as a state, we have lots of information about who holds credentials, certifications, and licensure for a variety of different roles. We also, every fall, collect information about who is working in our schools. But the one missing piece that we didn't have that was a need was vacancy. We've had local organizations that have tried to collect it. It changes literally day to day. So it's not something that you can just say, on the first day of September, what does it look like? Because it literally changes daily. So what we have done is based on some of the thinking around that Teach Maine plan, is to start working with the Region 1 Comprehensive Center to assist us in looking at how we can collect this information in a strategic way, but also in an accurate way. We've enlisted the support of some of our school units to be pilots in this initial project with us. And we're hopeful that this will lead us to a place where we will be able to say, these are areas within the state that we know anecdotally are our most challenging areas to fill positions. Or perhaps these are roles that are hardest. We already know that some of our student supports and special education positions, our bus driver positions, all of those were challenging to fill even before the pandemic, and that was exacerbated by the pandemic itself. But we're looking forward to having this project kind of move the needle on the information that we're going to be able to have to see where those vacancies are. I would also say that we are utilizing the support of a local business here. It's called Live and Work in Maine. We've expanded that with their partnership to say Live and Work and Teach in Maine, to be able to do nationwide promotion of education positions within our state. So we've always had job boards, electronic job boards that school units have used to post their vacancies. We're expanding that nationwide with the support of Live and Work in Maine to be able to have opportunities that are in our state be more visible across the country. I have to say it's a beautiful 73, 74, 75 degree day here. I'm in Portland, Maine. It's gorgeous. And if that's something that's attractive to folks, we would certainly love to have you come up. The colors aren't changing quite yet, but they're going to be here soon. So it's a beautiful place to live, and it's a beautiful place to teach. The other thing I would say before I turn it over to my new friend Dwight is that when we refer to like our Teach Maine plan and we talking about vacancies, just as I mentioned, while there are certainly a teacher shortage, there is an educator shortage on all different levels and all different roles across our school communities. And so even though sometimes we refer to the teacher shortage, we remind ourselves in Maine that really it's at all levels. It's administrative positions, really, again, throughout the school community, that makes schools the successes that they are. And so I just wanted to kind of put that disclaimer out front that really we're working to fill positions and have qualified folks at all different levels in our schools.
Yeah, first of all, Daniel, very clever to use this platform to actually recruit for Maine. So I think there's kudos for you doing that. I would be remiss, or I'd probably be in trouble here in Colorado. I live in Colorado Springs, but still spend a lot of time certainly across this state. And equally to Maine, Colorado is a beautiful state, and I know that districts and agencies across Colorado would love to have you relocate and probably have all kind of incentives to help make that happen. But Daniel, nice. I've got to be on my toes. You're really on it today. I first of all, everything that Daniel shared is just right. I do think states have a role to play. I always felt that when I was commissioner, and it's really nice to see states not only stepping up to say, we've got a teacher shortage, but we actually have an employee shortage across many positions in school districts and schools across this country, and probably and not probably in every state. So, Daniel, I really appreciate that you've extended that beyond just teachers. I know our focus is on teachers today, but that is a real issue, especially when you think about transportation, even custodial. I mean, all different positions are really an issue right now, and trying to be competitive salary wise really makes a big difference as well. So I know that's a big issue for governors and legislators, and certainly for state commissioners. I thinking about the data piece, Klaus, and I really appreciate that, using data, because a lot of claims get made, and sometimes I think our communities and our parents say, well, my school doesn't seem to have a lot of absences. So what is all this about? And is that real? And I do think with social media and so many things get posted, some of them true, some of them not so true, I think it is really important that we have good data. And Daniel has already listed some of the different agencies and folks that help bring that data together. I actually serve as an advisor with Whiteboard Advisors, and Whiteboard is very instrumental in helping to make sure that folks have good user data and accurate data. As I looked at some of the data, Klaus, it's projected by 2025, there will be over 300,000 teacher vacancies in this country. That's just pretty amazing to think about, 300,000 teacher vacancies. If you think about this school year present, over 70% of school districts reported opening school this year with vacancies. 70% of school, so it's not just an urban problem or a suburban problem or a rural problem. It's a school and a district problem across states. And if you have 70% of districts opening with vacancies, that's a pretty difficult position for a lot of districts to be in. I think about my previous school district, Clark County, Nevada, Las Vegas School District, the 5th largest school district in the country. This year, they opened school with over 2,000 vacancies. Now, certainly that's a large district, over 300,000 students, but anytime you would open school with thousands of vacancies, that's a really difficult situation for that district and for that community. Then I think about the preparation schools, the education schools. They've been seeing a decline in enrollment for over the past 20 years. And if you would look most recently, there are alarming numbers or lack of numbers of folks that are going into the teacher preparation program. So certainly to Daniel's point, I think working with partners in your community and in your state to think about how we still get a highly qualified teacher in front of our children, but we are going to have to look at alternative certifications or other opportunities. For example, the sponsor today, Teachers of Tomorrow, I think, where they not only help folks get certification, but they also make sure that there's training and support that is provided along with that. I didn't know it, but a good friend of mine, Dr. Heath Morrison, is actually the new CEO for Teachers of Tomorrow. And I'm so happy that we have someone that comes from the school districts themselves. Most recently, he was the superintendent in Montgomery County, Texas, just outside of Houston. But he's also worked as a superintendent in Charlotte-Mecklenburg, or even in Nevada, in the Washoe School District, which is Reno, which is the second largest school district in Nevada. So I'm really happy that we've got a lot of really smart people that are jumping in to try to help solve the problem.
Well, thank you. So let me actually sort of talk a little bit about this question, I think, to get back to what you were talking about, Dwight, regarding the urgency of filling empty spots when you have a district that's beginning with thousands of vacancies, and it's assuming that you have a good read on it. And I think, Daniel, what you were mentioning is that's the attempt of even getting that really good knowledge about what that is. So we've got this urgency to fill vacancies, but we also have the importance of quality, of establishing quality and ensuring that you actually have qualified people. And so how do you balance that need to fill positions in the short term with the importance of high quality supported clinical experience? How do you make that happen in ways that you think are feasible for states?
Yeah, Daniel, if you want to go first, I think it makes sense, especially because you're setting in a department right now.
Happy to. Thank you, Dwight. Before I answer that directly, I wanted to cue off of something that you had said, Dwight, around people just even interested going into education preparation programs. We've seen that decline here as well. I'll visit classrooms across the state, and having been a teacher myself, I'll say to a classroom of kids, who wants to be a teacher? And maybe a hand will go up. But that's something that, it's one thing that if we're not certifying folks, and it's another thing if people aren't achieving the degrees that are necessary for that. But if they're not even interested, that's something that we have to address even before that. We feel that that's part of our responsibility as the Department of Education, Maine, as well. It's another one of our strategic priorities, actually, is to inspire trust in the public education system. It's well surveyed that folks have compassion and trust and a love for their local school, but they often identify that the system at large is troubling. And so we're trying to wrestle with that dichotomy, but we feel it's part of our role to ensure that others know, everyone knows, that the public education system in our state is strong, and it's a place that people should see themselves working if they have the passion to do so. I would say that we've had a number of different initiatives to balance that that challenge of having folks in schools working with kids, but also have them meet high expectations and standards for whether that's certification and experience in some cases. It's tricky because I'll have superintendents tell me that, Dan, we can not only not have somebody apply that's certified, but we don't have anybody apply at all. There's just no one going in. So there have been a couple efforts in our state that have been very successful in, I think, the support for the individual, rather than literally throwing them into the deep end of a classroom, has been helpful. One of those practices that we have done for paraprofessionals, what we call educational technicians in our state, is a partnership between one of our community college campuses and school units, and they are doing kind of on-the-job training as well as supporting and mentoring those ed techs. So there's an online evening course component where they're learning kind of the basics. I don't want to call it a boot camp necessarily, but that really is what it is. It's setting them up for success. And then school units have been able to use them for a variety of roles in an ed tech role in our schools. Another one that's growing in promise and possibility is more recent. I was recently able to announce some opportunities for school units to apply for up to $250,000 each to have a grant to support apprenticeships. We've worked with our Maine Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Labor to develop pathways for apprenticeships. A lot of people think of plumbing and electricians as roles in which apprenticeships can occur, but as a matter of fact, it can happen in schools as well. And I think the key to that one, similarly, is that folks who are interested in pursuing careers in education can work in the schools and have employment while they're also having the training occur at the same time. And so it's a hand in hand. So again, rather than, more similar to a substitute situation where that fulfills an important role in our schools, but may not have all of the training and support that's necessary. The apprenticeship is an example of a situation where those folks can get right into schools, the schools get to know the folks, begin to build those relationships, and at the same time, they're also getting the training. Currently, our apprenticeship program is supporting these cohorts to become ed techs again, and that's worked through also our community college system. But the university system has also become a partner in this work. And so if those folks choose to pursue this even further, they'll switch over to the university system support and become certified teachers. So it's a short-term and a long-term plan for supporting and educating folks who are interested.
Well, that's very interesting. Now, do you have a sense, because just swinging back the data quickly, just a piece on that, Daniel, whether there is any attempt or ability to determine how many of those people who've been trained or moved up through these apprenticeships actually stick around? I mean, is there a retention metric there?
It's only been here for a year so far, and it was a program that didn't have the support of the apprenticeship when it first started. And so this is kind of now infused some energy and some funding into it to enable it to really fly. So let's do this webinar again next year, and I'll have more information for you to let you know how successful it's been. I will say, based on interest of other superintendents, this is occurring in particular in our Gorham Public Schools, which is a town just outside of Portland. The interest of other superintendents is growing, and now with these grants, they'll be able to utilize some funding to help it happen at their schools as well. So let's check back in, and I'll let you know that.
Thanks very much. And Dwight, I wanted to swing the question back to you now. This question of quality versus urgency. In your experience, both as a district leader and as a state agency leader, how has that been wrestled down?
Yeah, I think that is a real issue, Klaus, and certainly Daniel's done a nice job, I think, of not only highlighting how Maine is tackling that issue, but also sharing some really nice suggestions and ways to incentivize folks to continue to attract and also hopefully be in position where we can train up either through apprenticeships or mentoring or other ways to try to, not only increase the number of teachers and to do that in a way that we make sure that it's still high quality. I still remember during my days as superintendent, at that time, it was really about not only the certification of staff but also it became really popular that teachers had to pass an exam. And in some cases, like for elementary teachers, they had to pass exams that would be across a number of content areas. And I still remember a number of elementary teachers sometimes struggling with passing the math exam because it would be at a pretty high level. And in some cases, certainly they taught math, but in some cases they hadn't been really with a lot of experience in that content area for a while. And so I think having a high bar, and then, that teachers might move from state to state, and there would be a high bar to qualify to get certified in another state. And so I do think some of those, I wouldn't call those barriers, because I do think it was necessary to keep the bar high and to try to get the most highly qualified individuals in front of our students. But I do think we have to start looking at some of those and saying, do we have to start making some adjustments and start bringing some of those pieces down to make it a little easier? Daniel shared that Maine's a beautiful place and they'd like to welcome teachers. Well, it's also nice that folks move to Maine. That is pretty easy to get certified in Maine, and you don't have to jump through a lot of hoops to make that happen. I don't know what the process or situation is, but I do think states and state departments are having to really look at some of those pieces that really got elevated, probably 5 or 10 years ago, and whether we've got to make adjustments. Now, to your point around making sure, though, that we still, if we're going to look at adjusting some of those certification requirements or other requirements, that we still put a really high qualified person in front of young people. I took a look at, for example, in Texas, and Texas hires a lot of teachers. In 2 years, the TEA reported that in 2021 and 2023, the number of teachers that were leaving the profession almost matched the number of new hires that they needed for the state, around 50,000. So that's a real issue. And then you think about that equals about 13.5% of the 371,000 teachers in Texas. Now, that creates then what a certification looks like. So even more concerning, certainly from the TEA again, that the growth of uncertified teachers, well, about 30% of new teachers employed over the past year were falling into that category. So I think, to your point, Klaus, that as we look at trying to fill positions, there is a push that we are starting to hire more teachers that may not be certified. And as you can imagine, if you then go a little bit deeper, thinking about uncertified, or maybe in some cases, teachers that aren't as prepared, many times those teachers typically get placed in some of the most challenging classrooms. So then taking that a bit further, then when they go into those classrooms, it even creates more frustration around lack of preparation, maybe lack of support around, discipline or classroom management and some of those pieces, which then combines that a lot of those teachers then tend to quit. So you think about the investment, you think about if we don't have good training and good support for our teachers, then they go into frustration and they move out, and you've lost all that investment, and we kind of start over. So I'm not sure I have the solution. I certainly think Daniel suggested some really good solutions, but I think it's a real issue. And I think state departments, I'm no longer in a state department, but I bet state departments are really taking a look at that and trying to find the right balance. I always say, if you can, try to find the Goldilocks, not too hot, not too cold, but get it just right. And my guess is states are trying to figure that out.
Right, I can't resist, but you gave me another opportunity to promote Maine. So when you mentioned testing, because as a matter of fact, beginning last year, our certification tests are no longer required. That was an effort that I helped to shepherd over a 2-year process. It was during the pandemic, which was interesting, but we had Zoom, so we were good to go. In our state, the State Board of Education is the authority for the rule that governs certification. And that was really one of the cornerstones of the reform that we wanted to see. Here it's called Chapter 115 for certification purposes. I also want folks to be cognizant when they talk about certification changes. And don't get me wrong, I think in some cases it is easier. And we also have some ways in which it is easier to become certified in the state. But in the case of the test, we didn't just take the test away. There were actually alternatives. So if somebody wants to take the test, they can take the test. If somebody wants to do a portfolio or show a transcript analysis, those are options. So we like to have conversations with folks and say that it's not necessarily easier to get certified. It's just that there are more flexible ways, and some of the barriers have been removed for certification. And I will say, I do have some data on this. We had a 40% increase in certification applications this summer, and that again is coming a year after some of those significant changes occurred with our certification. So we hope those folks will pursue that certification and work here in our state.
Thank you. And so Daniel, just as a quick follow-up then, as you have those different kinds of pathways, right, those different bars to clear, shall we say, to achieve certification, is there any sense of trying to figure out which of these bars is most effective in giving you a sense of quality? And I know it's a very complex question, it's almost like a complex research question, but yeah, I mean, is there some sense that you have of like what sorts of things would be most likely to give you a sense of a teacher would be effective, as opposed to those kinds of bars or requirements that were perhaps less likely?
Sure. It's a question that we're excited to follow because it is early in the change of this rule. Along with the change with the testing came some other opportunities that are referred to as emergency certificates. And those really have some very low bars to cross in order to become certified. They're more time limited, so there's a shorter period of time that someone can hold those. But I would kind of describe it as if the whole certification process is the highway, we've added new on-ramps for folks to be able to kind of come into the process. The gold standard in our state is what's called a professional certificate. And, that has high expectations. Some folks say it's too high. Some folks say it's too low still. But that is what our certification is. Now, I'm a dad of two kids. I want highly qualified, exceptional teachers and supporting my kids in their learning. So I'm not about blowing away all of the expectations for people to become skilled educators. The other piece that I would say is that there's always a lot of talk around certification, which is one piece. I talk about it being a three-legged stool. Certification gives some indication of how successful someone might be because it has some indication of qualification. But there's also, as Dwight and I have both been in schools, there's the hiring process. Just because someone holds a certificate, they may not be a good fit for the community, or there may not be that match that we're looking for. So the hiring conditions and the interview process is another leg of that three-legged stool. And then I would say the third leg is the support and feedback that we're giving our educators as they're in those roles. So if you take one of those out, it kind of gets a little shaky, obviously. But together with the certification, the hiring criteria that you have for your staff, and the support and feedback that you're giving to the staff, that is really what sets up both an individual in that role and the school for success. And the state really has a hand in just one of those parts, and that's the certification piece. But we work closely with our school units to help support and get those folks in. So we have all these new on-ramps. It'll be interesting to see which, I think we can make some predictions just because of the preparation that's necessary for each of those on-ramps, but it'll be interesting to see how that works out in the long run.
Yeah, and Klaus, if I could just add a little bit to that, I think what Daniel has just described for Maine, I know there are probably different components of that happening in states across the country. Again, ECS is so skilled at kind of determining what states are doing and kind of sharing that so everybody has access to the different suggestions or opportunities or innovations or just, figuring out ways to get the job done. And so hopefully there's a way to kind of share that. Daniel, I really respect all the efforts that Maine is making to not only find that right balance or that sweet spot to say, getting it just right, the Goldilocks, so to speak, but to also recognize that you are going to have to make some adjustments and make some changes. Colorado is a very local control state. And so, if the Department of Education creates more flexibility, it still doesn't prohibit, I think, local boards of education to still make some decisions based on their community and their school district. And that seems just right to me. It seems like we should always trust our local communities to say what's right for us and what level of certification or what level instructor we want to make sure is in our community, and how do we balance that against the number of vacancies, especially in hard to staff positions, like sometimes in special education or even some of the math and sciences. So I just think there's a lot of room for us to learn from each other. What's always been great about public education is if someone figures out a better way of doing something, they share it. And, sometimes, I think in the private sector, you figure it out, you kind of keep control of it, and you don't want that secret out. Public education is just the exact opposite. If someone figures out, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a principal, whether it's a superintendent, or whether it's someone across that spectrum, they go to conferences, they present on it, they share that expertise, and that's what's right. I think that's what's going to help us not only make sure that we find the right balance, but that we continue to find ways to put highly qualified teachers in front of our kids.
Thanks very much, Joy. And I think I've got about 3 to 4, let's just say 3 more minutes for this last question, so we can leave the audience time for the audience questions. And I see quite a few have been pouring in. So briefly, I want to go back to this notion of recruitment, because you've both been recruiting heavily for your respective states here. And I feel like at some point we're going to have to provide equal time for the other 48, so they can do that as well. And you can all kind of recruit from each other. But the question of recruitment, I think, Daniel, you also made mention of the fact that there's a state role, right? And there's this three-legged stool, and maybe others that are more local. So the question is that, what levers can actually state leaders pull to help local leaders retain qualified teachers, to help the sort of harm that could be caused by this constant turnover? I mean, is there anything else you'd want to just very briefly mention? And then the same question will go for you as well, Dwight.
Sure. In Maine, I think it's a philosophy that we're promoting. I mentioned that we see it as our role to promote public education in general. But as far as educators are concerned, we have a philosophy and a mantra that we encourage innovation, we encourage risk taking, we encourage teachers working together to find, as Dwight was saying, if there's a group of problem solvers, it's got to be educators, because that's kind of what we naturally do. There are just some basic principles that we believe in our state that I think are encouraging for educators to be able to be successful in the roles that we do. So there are, I think, advantages that we have in our state, as well as far as generally our class sizes are smaller. I think we have a good deal of community support for our schools. Those conditions, I guess, I don't know if I would call them working conditions necessarily, but those conditions that are existing in our state, partnered with the messaging that the commissioner and I are able to do kind of on a broad scale. As a matter of fact, the commissioner yesterday was just on our public radio station talking about the very same things that we're doing this afternoon to help kind of our state as a whole understand the challenges and also the benefits of being educators in our state. So I think a lot of it comes down to the messaging that we're able to do and promote in our state.
Yeah, and Klaus, I'll be brief so that certainly we'd have some time for some questions if there are some. One thing, and Daniel alluded to it, I think working conditions really matter, and I think states can not only help support, but help demonstrate, things that make it easier for teachers and continue to find ways to help develop teachers. I think also making sure that we stay competitive, that teacher salaries matter a lot, and not only state by state, but against other professions that are competing to actually get our teachers or to take our teachers away from the classroom. So I think we've got to stay competitive, and that takes the legislature and the governor's office and everybody working together to help create additional revenue to support teacher salaries. And then finally, I just, one of the things that I always tried to pride myself in is to try to do more listening than talking. And I think listening to our teachers and seeing what suggestions and recommendations they have, certainly making sure that we have some communication with our teachers unions and folks that are also, have to be partners with us to help make this happen. And then, paying attention to principals and other folks that are actually in the trenches every day, trying to really, not only educate our kids at high levels, but make sure that we have the right employees to make that happen.
Thanks very much. I mean, that's been wonderful. I'm going to pass the baton to our audience who are going to have some questions. And I think that the way this is going to work is that Tony, you're going to feed some of them to me. I see that we have quite a few, and unfortunately, we probably won't be able to get through to all of them. But let me start maybe with the first one. And Tony, I think you're saying it's in my Zoom chat, but they're not there, but that's fine. I can see the Q&A, so no worries. Let's start with the first one. So this is from Kim Case, who's asking if you have any knowledge of unions that participate in teacher recruitment. Are there campaigns or initiatives that you know of for teacher recruitments that unions have spearheaded?
I think, Klaus, I do know that, at least in my experience, and I'll use, Denver, since I was most recently the interim superintendent here. I think the relationship and the support from union to not only, help support the right kind of conditions to retain teachers, because, part of recruiting teachers also mean you have to be really strong at retaining the teachers you have. And I think the union has been a tremendous partner with Denver Public Schools in not only looking at the development and some of the challenges that they hear and then helping to figure out ways to address those, but really also partnering in recruiting. I know that my son is a high school math teacher right here in Denver Public Schools, and the current union president was actually part of his mentor and really helped supported getting him to a high qualified teacher. So I think unions, in most cases and in a lot of states and a lot of districts, has been a really strong partner in helping to not only recruit teachers, but more importantly, to help retain teachers.
I'd say it's a very similar situation in Maine. The Maine Education Association is a partner with us on many different things. We meet with them and other organizations within our state twice a month, actually, and again, problem solve together. This being one of those topics. And I would just echo what Dwight has said: is not only is it a recruitment, but in the case of the MEA, I would say it's even more so that members are there to support and mentor and help new educators in particular be successful. I mean, naturally, we want to help each other be successful, and I think that's in a big way that MEA helps to support new educators kind of get their groove and get their feet on the ground when it comes to being a new teacher.
Thanks. Another question we have is that is basically how we rationalize this change from moving away from certification to any teachers who were told they needed certification for their career. So the questioner puts it this way: they say, if it's not needed, why did we have these requirements for so long?
That conversation came up quite a bit in our rule work, and I think traditionally there's been a lot of focus on content area, and in some cases rightfully so, right? We want people to be able to teach things accurately, for instance, and have a good background in that. So I think that's where a lot of that has been rooted. The other thing I would say was similarly with when we were requiring tests, sometimes content area is an easy thing to be able to measure through a test. But I think as we're kind of developing and maturing in our understanding of what makes a successful educator, I would say that relationship is one piece that's probably the most critical piece, that somebody that's able to make good connections with kids. That's harder to measure on a test, maybe impossible. And so I think that's what we're able to do is it's a mind shift, that the change from test requirement to not test requirement. I wouldn't say it was difficult necessarily, but it required and necessitated a lot of conversation and understanding and research to make that change. So I think it's a change in perspective on what it really means to have somebody who is going to be a successful educator. And if it is content-based, then maybe there's a little more emphasis on that as well.
Yeah, and I would just quickly add to that, Klaus. I'm not sure I'm quite ready to go on record to say that it's not necessary or that it is not preferred. But I do think we have to find the right balance. For example, I think back to getting my teacher's degree in college. There were a number of classes that were associated with the content area or teaching, but there was a lot of other classes that I had to take that really had no connection. And it was just part of that college experience. And so I think we can do a lot better job working with our partners in higher ed to just say, can we pinpoint and focus and make it a shorter experience? There might still be certification, but I think there's ways that we can make that certification quicker and more reasonable in cost and in a more timely fashion. And then second, I know some of the alternative certification programs are working with folks that already have a degree. So they have a college degree. So now it's just giving them that teacher's degree, which I think we can do that certification a lot quicker. So I think those are some of the things that, a lot of states are focusing on. And there's folks in other content areas that want to move into teaching. So to Daniel's point, how do we give them the content quickly, but also help them really understand the importance of relationships?
Thank you very much. There's so many good questions here. I know we can't get to all of them, but I'll do another one. How about this one? This is from Farzam Borumband, and apologies if I mispronounced that. The question is, rather than focusing on vacancies, are you aware of any work to look at higher education students to begin an educator preparation program and then switch majors or do not complete it? So is there any opportunity to partner with universities to study why students in the pipeline are changing from that major? So it's almost the flip side of what you said, right? Where you're taking people who start somewhere else and you lure them into teaching. What happens to those who start in teaching and get lured outside?
Yeah, I would just say it, that probably is a focus area on both fronts. For example, during my time in Las Vegas, we made an effort that students that graduated that wanted to go into teaching, we helped support their tuition in doing that. And what we would find is about halfway through, some of the students, even with full tuition being paid, would either not finish or switch to a different content area. So we really had to focus on working with our university partners to say, what are we missing? Are we making sure that some of the students that are now entering post-secondary or our colleges that may be first-time college students for their families, and have we made that environment nurturing, and have we made sure that we focused on the right things to help support those students all the way through the program? So I do think there's lots of room for K-12 and higher ed to continue to work together to figure out ways how we can solve these problems. But I do think it can certainly be an issue for sure.
Now I've got another question that I think it's a big question. I know you can't possibly do it justice, but it's about teacher diversity, where there's a lot of research right now on the importance of that. So what strategies are being used in states to increase diversity in the education workforce? Anything that resonates with you?
Well, one program that I actually was recently had been made aware of and was trying to learn a lot more about is called the 1 Million Teachers of Color. I don't know if either of you have heard of that. The 1 Million Teachers of Color campaign has a goal of adding 1 million teachers of color and 30,000 leaders of color to the education workforce over the next decade. They will be supporting policies and practices that redefine the role of teachers, support progressive pathways to the profession, and advance inclusive environments designed for teachers and leaders of color to bring their full authentic selves to the classroom. So I'm really excited to know that there are efforts out there such as that, or the other efforts where they're also working to try to support preschool and early childhood teachers, because there's a real shortage there as well. So there are a number of these partnerships. I think partly in some cases we've got to do a better job of making sure that people are aware of them and where they can get connected to them if they choose.
That's exciting work. In our state, just an example is some of the adult education programs in our school systems are working with often parents of kids in the schools to help them, whether it's develop English proficiency or other skill sets that they may need, who are new Americans that have come to our state, get accelerated to be prepared to be credentialed. And one of the pieces that we see sometimes is that they may have been an educator. I'll just use educator since that's why we're here, in a different place, and aren't able to immediately use those skills here in our state. And so I would just encourage folks to see how adult education programs are able to accelerate that preparedness for folks who may have been an educator for quite a bit of time, to be able to do that here in our schools as well.
Great. Well, thanks so much. I think we've got time for one more question, and then we'll have to wrap it up. And this is a question that came about teacher professional development. How does professional learning play into strategies to attract and retain teachers? Again, you're going to have to take a massive subject and condense it into a short amount of time.
Well, I think it plays a tremendous role. And, what's great about living in this day and time is the benefits of technology. And I think there are so many opportunities for anywhere, anytime learning. And that's really having a positive impact, I think, on learners being able to access it on their own time. We know that teachers are really busy teaching, and then they're really busy in their own lives and have families and all of those things. So creating that opportunity for anytime, anywhere learning, I think really has a positive impact.
I would agree. I mentioned earlier the peer-to-peer learning that has always been part of school professional learning has been expanded greatly by the use of technology, so that we can have folks on all corners of our state connecting and learning together, collaborating on that work. Often that has led to another piece that we hear a bit about job satisfaction is leadership opportunities. And so we've actually made opportunities for folks across the state to become leaders with us in developing content or facilitating conversations. And so it's multifaceted, as you said, Klaus, and but it's all good stuff, and we're proud of that work that we're doing.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I mean, you've fit a lot of really important content into what is necessarily a short amount of time on a very complex topic. So I really, really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to turn things back to Tony, who's much better at wrapping things up than I am.
Thank you, Klaus. And thank you for your skillful moderation, and of course, Dwight and Daniel, for your great insights today. It was a great privilege to have you both feature and share a little bit more about your state and what you all are doing. So thank you again. I also want to give a big thanks to everyone in the audience for joining us today for our webinar. Again, please remember that ECS is here to support you in your work. We hope that you are taking away at least one idea from today's session that may support you in the great work you're doing in your state. If you have any questions or requests related to today's session, please feel free to reach out to Gerardo Silva Padron, policy researcher here at ECS. And as I mentioned earlier today, today's recording will be shared with you in the post-event email. Finally, our next Partnering for Success webinar, focused on funding innovation with federal relief, will be on October 25th at 2 p.m. Central Time. You can register using the link that has been placed in our chat, or you can check your post-event email for the registration details. With that, we have concluded our webinar for today. Thank you again for joining us, and I hope that you all have a great rest of your week.